Y'all, the final dungeon of Wallaru is one of the most highly anticipated events in Wizard101 history, and today I wanted to talk about everything we know about it and even recent statements that Wiz themselves have said about it. I think this is something a lot of people care about, so let's dive right into it. So when they first announced that this actual Wallaru dungeon was a thing, but it was going to be released later, they also talked about everything that this dungeon would involve in terms of gameplay, right? Like, so the things that we already kind of know already is that hats, robes, boots, and wands are going to drop from this dungeon. But as far as what this dungeon is, what it'll do for the game, those types of things we've only really known from stray comments here and there from Wizard101 and people that work there. So I wanted to put that all together and speculate on what we might expect early next year when this dungeon is expected to release. So for one, right away, in the original announcement, they did say that the reason for the delay is that there's going to be new mechanics. Now, this was like a very vague thing to say because new mechanics could be a lot. It could be like boss cheats, or it could be like, you know, the wizards have to do stuff in the dungeon where they have to move differently than they normally do. But as recently as literally this week, in response to some DMs, one of the community managers actually said more about exactly what these new mechanics might be. So somebody asked them literally, like, you know, if this dungeon is going to be like a raid, and Kyle, the community manager, said this is actually very much in line with what they're doing. However, unlike a raid, it's not going to be 12 people, and presumably unlike a raid, you do not have to be in a guild to do it. And as if this statement wasn't enough, Cam, one of the devs that works for the game, also referred to the upcoming dungeon as somewhat of a mini raid. He drew comparisons to the Labyrinth, which I would argue is, you know, kind of a soft dungeon compared to what we, you know, consider dungeons now, like Tartarus and Darkmoor. But with all these statements put together, we can kind of see a picture forming, right? It's something with new mechanics, which I assume are new types of puzzles that resemble raids and require teamwork, but with 4 people. And it'll also cap off the entire world of Wallaru and offer challenging drops and offer endgame gear, much like older dungeons that we're used to, like Darkmoor and Tartarus. I do think when the word raid is used in any context, in any scenario in the Wiz community, there's like a lot of red flags, and I do think that's probably going to be the gut reaction for a lot of people. But I do think the context is very, very important. Like, I think a raid as it is right now, I feel like having to be in a guild and requiring 11 other people, like, that's the part that kind of makes it maybe a little bit more unpopular. But the actual, like, format of the raid and the actual content of the dungeons, I think it's extremely fun to watch. And I think a lot of people actually enjoy doing it because it offers them a real challenge. And I think that's what this is going to be. I don't think this is going to be, like, you know, a nuisance to do. I think it's actually just going to be something that requires teamwork, much like older dungeons that we're used to in a 4-player format. And as far as the difficulty, I assume it's not going to be anywhere close to as difficult of a raid, and it should have pity systems much like the raid itself regardless. So I don't think this is going to be something that you farm like crazy. I think it's something that you get good at running a few times with a few people, and then maybe there's reasons to go back for extra drops. We all do have to keep in mind that this is a main world, and at the base of it, a main world should be doable by the majority of the people that play it, even if there are challenges. I think Wallaru specifically, they made it easy, and then they made it a little bit more challenging by making you maybe change your deck around certain bosses. I think everyone's familiar that's quested through Wallaru. Like, these campfire bosses are absolutely nuts. Like, the Urks that you fight, they're crazy, but they're so doable if you just learn from how you've died. Like, that, I've done this now on a bunch of wizards, and yes, it's challenging, but it's definitely doable. And I think that's a balance you're gonna have to strike. I think you're gonna have to make it require the teamwork of maybe a raid, minus maybe needing to be on Discord to do it. Maybe don't go that far, but you also have to keep in mind that unlike the side content that we've grown accustomed to being hard, this can't really be that hard. And what I do think is very important to note, and specifically Cam's statement about this, is that there will be a standard mode and a challenge mode. Now, I have yet to really interact with the challenge mode, mainly because I don't feel like choosing to challenge myself gives me anything in terms of time or drops. If you can quickly do a standard mode version of a boss, you're always going to be better off doing that than a challenge mode, but who knows? Maybe in the context of a dungeon that's capping an arc, and it probably is really justified in being challenging or raid-like, maybe in that scenario, a standard mode and a challenge mode are going to really differentiate themselves. This might be the first application of the challenge mode that really matters. As far as I'm concerned, I feel like it hasn't really mattered up to this point. I think their badge system that they rolled out with Wallaru is one of the best things that they've done, and honestly, it's probably the easiest way they can make things challenging without making it tedious to farm. You guys have probably seen a video on this, but if not, basically, right, if I, for example, defeat Mr. Montgomery 10 times, I could use Dream Water, which is a reagent that drops throughout Wallaru, to craft anything that Mr. Montgomery drops. Using that logic, they could have made Mr. Montgomery as hard as they wanted. As long as I managed to beat him 10 times, I could get any of his drops, right? It's not the same type of farming that we're used to, and it really opens the door to a lot of stuff, right? You could make this dungeon difficult but not tedious. You could make it maybe easier and approachable, but maybe the drop rates are worse. The fact that it's a main world and it's 4 people makes the whole statement of a mini raid, it's just going to be something that's very, very different. What I really hope is, if it's done well, maybe this is something that could encourage people to be like, yo, this wasn't awful, this was fun, let me see, maybe I could join a guild or make a guild and do raids as well. I think, you know, a good progression of difficulty rather than what we have right now compared to a raid would actually be very healthy for the game. That's what I hope this dungeon looks like, and because it's the end of the arc, I hope it's a memorable dungeon too. And speaking of the finality of the arc, right, another comment that we do know about this is also from a community manager related to the original statement, right, when people were asking like a bunch of questions in the Discord where the statement was made that Wallaru dungeon was getting, you know, delayed. We also received a clarification that this is going to tell us a lot about the next arc. I think one thing about the end of Wallaru that I didn't really love is that there isn't really anything that tells you what's going to happen next, right? Like at the end of Chrysalis, we see Old Cobb and he's ready to take over the spiral, right? You know what's next. And I believe at the end of Imperia, Sybil, the tree in the Arcanum, does offer a lot of foreshadowing on the nothingness that's coming. And yet we got very little of that. I have a feeling this was all planned for the dungeon, and because it's the nightmare, what I want to assume is that we're going to see our worst nightmare, maybe our biggest threat yet. As far as what this detail that they're going to be looking into to like create the arc, you know, the 5th arc around, that's really up for speculation. What I will say is, during the whole arc, there was one thing that really hopped out at the end of Novus specifically. At the end of Novus, during the confrontation with all of these civilizations, one thing that came out was that we are not from the spiral. It was super dramatic. If you guys were listening to the dialogue, it probably hopped out to you too. There's also an element earlier in the arc where we're only able to enter what I want to say is like the dream plane or something because we're not from the spiral. This was like some dialogue that we shared with Xander. Multiple times, the fact that we are not from the spiral and presumably from Earth seemed to matter just enough to be mentioned. And I can't help but wonder why this was mentioned multiple times in the last arc, but not enough for it to really be a plot element. It almost makes me think that our origin as wizards is going to be a big factor of the next arc, especially now that we've started to fight universal forces. I think not being from the spiral actually means something when it comes to being the wizard, and I think that theme is something that they might look into next arc. This is purely speculation, but just because we know that this dungeon is going to set up something, that's the only thing I can think of that really popped up a lot when I was questing through this arc. So we'll see what they set up. All I know is, like, I'm excited for what's next, because I'm done with nothing. I'm done with Dasein. I'm done with them, all right? But I want something new. And whatever the next big bad is, I'm ready for it. Hopefully this dungeon is something that a lot of people find fun, doable, Darkmoor-esque, because I feel like that's like one of the most popular things that Wiz has ever added. And let's also hope that it sets us up for a lot of fun in the future. Let me know what you guys think of what the dungeon is going to be about, how hard it's going to be, what it's going to look like from a team standpoint. Like, will it be like a raid? What are y'all excited for, and what are y'all nervous? As always, drop a like if you enjoyed, leave a sub if you're new, and if somebody hasn't told you you're awesome today, they doing something wrong. Stay awesome. See y'all soon. And yeah.